Thanks. Yeah, so thanks for the introductions, Richard and Erica. Thanks for having me, and thanks everyone for coming. And so, as Richard said, this is really a presentation, some work resulting out of this NIHR School for Public Health Research project we have about road user charging that started about 18 months ago. And I'm sort of not going to talk about that in huge detail, but we can sort of talk a little bit about some of those plans at the end. Kind of an outline for the next sort of 30 or 40 minutes or at the start. I'm just going to talk about what is road user charging. We're going to have some historical context that sort of goes back to the 1960s, and then going to talk about some more recent developments and policy options, which some of you may be aware of, which I would say are going to make road user charging more likely to be implemented in more serious forms pretty in the near future, and what the existing evidence tells us about that. It's probably worth saying here that, you know, and we'll talk about this, there are a wide range of impacts of road user charging, and in the existing evidence going to focus mainly on some transport impacts, air pollution and road traffic incidents, and we can sort of talk about at the end about other things which people are interested in and which might be missing from that list. A note on terminology just at the start is that there are a number of terms which are used more or less interchangeably, and they include sort of road pricing, congestion charging, value pricing, and urban road charging. I refer to it mainly as road user charging. Some people refer to road pricing to refer mainly to charging people a certain amount per kilometre driven, and road user charging to be more specifically about urban areas, but I'll sort of refer to both of these as road user charging. What is road user charging? So we started this NIHR project, as I say, about 18 months ago. So we started the thinking for it probably about 2.5 years ago. And one thing 2.5 years ago, people would often say to me, I mean, aware that I'm based in London, is I would say, well, we'll have this interest in road user charging. And a lot of people would say, well, isn't this, you know, that's all very well for London, but, you know, we don't want more London-centric research. London already has a good transport system, it has good public transport, and it's very different to other areas. But actually, as I think probably people are aware now, road user charging is not just an issue for London, and it's not just the London congestion charge. And we can think of it as there being a range of methods of road user charging. So these can be either going into certain areas, and so that's things like motorway tolls, which people are familiar with, cordon charging, so that's sort of crossing into an area, so that is, for example, the London congestion charging zone, or for any use within a specified area. It's commonly referred to as area charging. It's quite a broad term, or certainly we are using it broadly, and there are lots of different mechanisms, lots of different ways road user charges can be implemented. And so if we will talk a bit later about some of the specific schemes that are in place at the minute, but charges can vary by the time of day, by vehicle class. And so that's, you can think of the ultra low emission zone in London, which charges cars which are broadly speaking more polluting, or assessment of emission standards. So it's a broad term and can be used in lots of different ways. But what really ties them all together is that they aim to make motorists pay more directly for their road use. And so they do this partly to manage road demand. And so there are often ideas where we might say we're going to charge people higher pound amounts to drive on roads which are congested than roads which are not congested. There are different schemes in place internationally and have been for quite some time now. These, as you would imagine, have differing objectives, but they tend to be firstly around actually controlling congestion and traffic levels, and secondly, improvements to what we broadly conceive of as the environment. We'll move on now to some of the sort of historical context. And this probably, I would say that, serious consideration of road user charging goes back to 1962, when Reuben Jacob SMED was commissioned by the British government to examine the technical feasibility of implementing road user charging. SMED produced a detailed but reasonably short report, actually, that set out that there were three main impacts from road use. There is the wear and tear on roads, there is congestion, and there are what he referred to as social risks, and that is things like accidents, noise, and fumes. And the central conclusion of SMED really was that the road user should pay the costs that he or she imposes upon others. The SMED report was set out to examine how various forms of taxes could be levied. It wasn't, and it's worth clarifying that it wasn't set up to directly assess whether or not the total amounts that motorists should be paying would change, but it did assume that road user charges would in some sense be replacing other charges for using roads. The key one of the key quotes from the summary is that it excludes social risks. SMED, it's about the higher speeds from road user charges would be estimated to have a net gain to society of about £100 million. That's a lot of money now, and back in 1964, that was even more money than it is at the moment. It's worth saying also that SMED was clear that road user charges were not and won't be a cure for everything, and they won't certainly be a cure for having to build and maintain new roads. And it's worth bearing in mind that back in 1962, when SMED started this work, cars, vans, and taxis made up about 57% of the passenger distance travelled in the UK, and we've seen huge changes in the intervening time period, and now that figure has risen to about 83%. So there's some of these pressures in the transport system have increased significantly since SMED reported. And so my final slide on SMED is that he set out his panel set out some essential and desirable characteristics, requirements of a road user charging system. This is this list of the 9 essential requirements, and SMED hit upon the fact that the incidence of this system upon individual road users should be accepted as fair, and this fairness point is obviously very important, and we see the importance of fairness and acceptability in more recent policy debates. SMED, it's going to, I think, be no surprise to anyone that SMED was not acted on. It's reported, I mean, this is based on sort of Wikipedia, but it's reported that the Prime Minister said we should take a vow that if we're re-elected, we'll never set up a study like this one again. So SMED, the ideas were not popular, even though there was a lot of scholarship, and they were very clear that there was huge potential for road user charging. If we skip forward in time significantly, there was some serious interest in road user charging in the Labour government, and so I'm 36. I don't particularly, I have to say, remember this happening, although it was very much in my lifetime. Some people potentially do remember it happening, but when Alistair Darling was Transport Secretary in 2003, they had a paper called Managing Our Roads, and that set out the big challenges next 30 years. And essentially that said that road user charging should be seriously considered in order to keep the road network and the transport system working optimally. He commissioned a comprehensive study of how to best make use of existing capacity, and this reported in 2004, the Road Pricing Feasibility Study, as you say, examined how we could better utilize the road network. In some ways similar to SMED, it was positive, probably less positive than SMED, about road user charging, but it did conclude that road user charging is becoming feasible, that road user charging could meet the government's objectives to deliver a more efficient approach to transport pricing, to be fair, respect privacy, and to deliver both higher economic growth and environmental benefits. I did also say that the implementation will require the promotion of a greater degree of public consensus than was apparent at the time. Also, around this time, there was the Eddington Transport Study, and Eddington was the outgoing chief exec of BA and was asked to advise on the long-term impacts of transport strategy to UK productivity and growth. His report came in, I think, 4 or 5 volumes, very lengthy, quite focused on the economic aspects, but it did say that one of the key area of economic growth in the next 20 years was going to be in urban and congested areas, and that we were going to need a way to tackle this. And he says that road pricing is an economic no-brainer. Again, these ideas were not acted on. The basics of the idea was that vehicles would have a satellite receiver, and depending on what road you were driving on, you would be charged between 2 pence per mile and £1.34. This was around about the time when that website was launched, where people could, websites were launched where people could sign petitions, and 1.8 million people signed an online petition against this idea of Tony Blair for a national road user charging scheme. Initially, the government tried to limp on with the policy. So you see this headline where Blair rebuffed the 1.8 million who signed the petition, but really this more or less sounded the death knell. Road use charging, the policy limped on a little bit, but in the end, it didn't make it into the 2010 manifesto. And once we got post 2010, the coalition government made a little bit of noise about this, and it made a little bit of noise around the idea that tolls could be used to finance new roads to a greater degree, but this never came out in their 2013 report onto the issue. Although the Blair government was unsuccessful in their plan to get through this national road user charging scheme, in the Local Transport Act 2008, they did manage to put through legislation which removed the requirement for local areas to consult the Secretary of State for their schemes. So there was a potential that local areas could implement their own schemes more easily than they previously could have. These schemes never particularly got off the ground, and the policy was rescinded, I think, by the coalition government. But this represents, I think, a bit of a shift between ideas of having a national road user charging scheme and having these different local schemes, which, that tension between a national and a local system still persists to this day. More recent policy developments, moving on to sort of things that have happened in the last 3 or 4 years. So this slide is from a presentation I gave about 18 months ago. I've kept it in here as I think broadly this is still true. So there are really increasing concerns around air pollution and clean air. And I think that this is really driving a lot of the agitation around road user charging. There are a lot more community groups and NGOs which are making serious noise about it. And also, interestingly, in the Chief Medical Officer report in 2017, Sally Davies said that we need to have a system where we are collecting the transport and health data to monitor any impacts of road user charging as those schemes come forward. It's also worth saying that there are still significant financial sustainability pressures on the transport system, and sort of at a very high level, 2 of the big income streams are vehicle excise duty, aka car tax, and that is being eaten into by electric cars, and fuel duty, which is since 2011-12, fuel duty continues to not rise, continues to stay at the same level, partly because I think government manifestos, it's never seen as a very popular ticket item to say we're going to increase the amount that we are making people pay for fuel. So at the minute it's 58.5p a litre. And also, despite you hear these sort of concerns around peak car spotment for transport, it's still driving a bit, forecasting there being more driving in the future. So there's big financial pressures and big pressures in terms of the number of vehicles which are needing to be moved. Now, moving slightly away from just the transport focused ideas of road user charging, clean air zones are one of these more recent local policies which represent potential, I hesitate to use the word potential, they represent a mechanism for areas to implement road user charging. And so clean air zones they're not a pre-specified intervention, but recognizing huge concerns around air pollution, DEFRA set out guidance for local authorities on whether and how to implement clean air zones. The clean air zone implement divided into charging clean air zones and non-charging clean air zones. And if local areas decide to have charging clean air zones, they can decide to charge motorized vehicles to a differing extent. So they can decide to charge more or less every motorized vehicle, or they can just decide to charge in Class A buses, coaches, and private hire vehicles. There was a little bit of traction on this, and there still is, but we're going to talk about two local examples briefly. So Newcastle consulted on implementing a clean air zone. And they had a consultation in May, I think this was May 2019. They initially had plans to charge all vehicles, but after consultation, they had about 50,000 responses, and they limited to just charging these vehicles in category A. But the conclusion from Newcastle, the Newcastle local authority from this consultation was that the public are willing to take action on air pollution, but support is needed. So they had these plans to go ahead with charging vehicles in category A. The second local example is Bath. And so Bath had planned to charge higher emission vehicles for driving through the city centre. And this plan was it was delayed a little bit because of coronavirus, but actually this is going ahead. And so Bath, this is due to start happening around about the middle of March. So soon Bath is going to be charging these vehicles, you can see, to drive through the city centre. But inevitably, what has happened to some of these local schemes, and one of the big pieces of national context is COVID-19 and pandemic associated lockdowns, changes to many areas of life, including transport. And this is just a graph from some Department for Transport data of daily car use as a percentage the previous year. And so you can see that in lockdown 1, this was down to about 30% of previous year's levels. And really, I would say that one thing that has come out of the lockdown is there was those early days where there were reports that air quality had improved in lots of places because of the lockdown, and that was followed shortly thereafter by concerns around whether there was going to be a resurgence of cars, whether there were going to be more cars, more vehicles on the road than before. And so this, like lots of things, has changed how the public policymakers, researchers are thinking about what is possible, what is desirable. The other big national piece of context that I think we can say is road more likely than 9.5 years from now, there's going to be a ban on sales of petrol and diesel cars. This in if you put together the money that is being raised from vehicle excise duty and the money from fuel duty, this in theory leaves this £40 billion tax shortfall. And so there are big concerns among lots of people about what are we going to do if people are shifted fully to electric cars and we no longer have diesel and petrol cars. In December 2020, so very recently, the Transport Committee launched this inquiry on zero emission vehicles and road pricing. And the reason why these are lumped together in this inquiry is because a move to zero emission vehicles really threatens that £40 billion, which is coming from petrol and diesel cars at the minute. It's maybe worth saying that the phrase £40 billion black hole, I think, has been bandied around a lot. That is potentially a bit of an overstatement. You know, that wouldn't go all the way to zero overnight, but it would likely decline sharply. And the Transport Committee have just closed their consultation on evidence for this, and you can read their questions here, but their sort of questions are broadly around what can we learn from other countries, what is the case on a number of different axes for implementing it, and how could it best be done, and what is the public support for it, and what might be needed if people were going to accept such a scheme. Now, I'm going to move on now to sort of talking about my interpretation, I guess, of some of the existing evidence. And as I said at the start, there are a wide range of possible impacts of road user charges. So here I'm only going to focus on three. So I'm going to focus on travel patterns and behaviour, pollution, and road traffic incidents. It's also worth saying that a lot of the evidence a lot of the UK evidence comes from the London congestion charge, and so there's a lack of evidence, as you might imagine, from other places in the UK because they have not had these schemes. But there is evidence, there's other international evidence from different schemes, and there is some evidence modelling potential impacts of road user charges. On travel patterns and behaviours, if you look at some of the early reports and evaluations from Transport for London when they brought in the congestion charge in 2003, this found immediate reductions in private motorised vehicles and increases in buses, walking and cycling. So what you might expect if you charge people to drive private motorised vehicles, they would move to public transport, and you know, you could reasonably say that London has a very good public transport system, and so this shift across to public transport is easier than it could be in other places. The low emission zone is another intervention which came in London in 2008, and it's associated with a change to people being in more electric vehicles, and also changes in fleet composition away from the most polluting vehicles. I'm just gonna these next few slides just give a brief flavour of some of the international evidence. So there's evidence from Greece that a charging zone in Athens had a reduction in the number of cars entering the zone. There was a change in this. It was not just restricted to when vehicles are being charged. This lasted outside of that time. In Austria, there's a system of charging people for the distance that they drive, and that's been linked to increases in public transport use and decrease in how far people are traveling on private transport. And in Milan, there's a few very interesting research papers from Milan, and that's found a sort of 14% reduction of vehicles entering this area of the city where people were charged. I and potentially lots of people here, I would say I'm a public health person, and I consider a lot of these transport issues through the lens of public health. And you know, one of the big things there, and you know, one of the things I've always been interested in is active travel, people walking and cycling. You know, what are the health benefits of that? What are the ways that we can make people do that? also, like with Richard's PhD and some further work, what are the potential health benefits of public transport? And so one thing that would be potentially good from a public health perspective is if these road user charging schemes were moving people away from driving towards walking or cycling, this modal shift, as we call it. But so this paper is from 2015. It's from a little while ago, but it concludes. It looks at five different schemes. It has 12 natural experiments included, and it says that there's a lack of convincing real-world evidence on people actually shifting to walking and cycling, and that is partly because there are a limited number of schemes in different places, and so our ability to judge some of this evidence is limited. But overall, it does. It says this on the slide, but overall, the evidence does say that, as we would expect, you can change some people's travel behaviours, but a wide range of impacts are also possible. Are people changing their route? Are people changing when they're driving, when they're traveling? So generalization from this evidence is difficult, but it does suggest that, as we would expect, road user charges can change people's travel behaviour. Secondly, air pollution. So there's been much interest recently in the impacts of the ultra low emission zone in London. And so the ultra low emission zone, ULEZ, as it's called, charges vehicles 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It only charges broadly, you can think of as more polluting vehicles. So if they are not meeting their petrol cars, which don't meet Euro 4 standards, diesel cars, which don't meet Euro 6 standards, they are charged £12.50 a day. TfL monitoring from their roadside sites concluded that nitrogen dioxide reduced by about 36% in the zone, and that there wasn't, crucially, an increase in pollution on these boundary roads where I might imagine traffic would be diverted to. Because of the design of ULEZ, this is partly around there being fewer of these more polluting vehicles on the road. So potentially people are getting rid of their older polluting vehicles and moving to vehicles which cause less air pollution. This interest was replicated. I'm not sure how well people can see this table actually, but as you imagine, when the 2003 London congestion charge went in, there was a similar interest in the air pollution impacts of that. And this is just one table from an evaluation of that, looking at NOx and PM10 emissions. And so, not sure how well people can see this, but so IRR is more or less the boundary roads. So it's looking at NOx on the boundary roads and inside the charging zone. And the overall change on the boundary roads was a slight increase in NOx, but a large increase of 12% of NOx inside the charging zone. But because of changes and vehicle technology, these combined to make decreases in NOx both inside the zone and at the boundary. And this table doesn't show it, but it's partly because a lot of the increased traffic were buses sort of inside the zone and at the boundary road, and these buses at the same time were fitted with technology to reduce the air pollution they were giving out. And this is a figure from a paper in Milan. And interestingly, Milan has had this EcoPass scheme charging people to drive through the city centre. And these people have looked, there was a brief period when the policy was suspended. There was some legal uncertainty about it. And essentially it has the period when road pricing was instated, and then there was a suspension of the system when the levels of air pollution went up, and then when pricing was reinstated, they went back down. So this, in terms of, you think about sort of natural experimental designs, this actually suggests that when you remove these schemes, things do go back up. And just the sort of third big impact I'm going to talk about is road traffic incidents. And these, I think, worth saying, are often overlooked as a health burden in the UK, but it's about 1,700 deaths on the road, about 26,000 serious injuries. And this paper by Green et al. Used some very detailed accident data to look at monthly accidents inside the congestion zone, inside charging times, and at the boundaries of the London congestion charging zone. This figure shows they have compared, so I'm not sure how well people can make this out, but this line here is London before the congestion charge came in, and the comparison is an average of 20 other main cities in the UK. And you can see that when the congestion zone comes in, the accidents reduce quite dramatically in London inside the zone. And so those declines were about 30 accidents, decline of about 30 accidents per month. They found the same impacts. They found decreases at the boundaries of the congestion charging zone, and they also found the same impacts for serious and fatal accidents. So there's reasonable evidence that the London congestion charging zone did reduce the number of road accidents. And similarly, evidence from Milan found a sort of 8% decline in accidents across the whole city when they implemented road user charging. Now, a lot of these evaluations presented here, they try to separate out the individual impacts of road user charges. And, you know, as I've said, there's, in some senses, a limited number of schemes, and so trying to generalize this evidence can be difficult, and trying to really identify exactly what works can be difficult. And this is particularly the case, I would say, for air pollution, where a wide range of factors, including number of vehicles, type of vehicles, fleet composition, speed, these are all impacting, and weather are all impacting what is happening with air pollution. And it's important to remember that, in common with other transport interventions, road user charges are not going to fix everything in our transport system. We need to be aware of saying that that is the case, and that the evidence says that, but they may have a useful supporting role to play. Now, just sort of wrapping up here, but a few of the, what I would say is underexplored research questions are: the inequality impacts of road user charging remain under considered. This is something which is obviously very important in terms of who might win and who might lose from such systems. And, you know, really any policies are going to need careful design. And the real nuts and bolts of the finances are quite complex. There are, say, macroeconomic factors in terms of what is happening to GDP, but also factors what is happening to fuel duty, and there's, you know, the actual finances of this need real finessing. It's likely that road user charging, as I say, isn't going to be a solution for every problem, and it's likely not to be a solution for everywhere. But we might more usefully think, where might it work and what is required to make it work. And also, you know, we probably have not quite the understanding that we would like around what are the mechanisms of any potential impacts. And acceptability is a key, as I sort of flagged towards the start. Acceptability is a key factor, and this is the real both national and local schemes in the start. Some people would say that under certain conditions, road user charging schemes would be acceptable, and the RAC Foundation, so 10 years ago, had some work on the acceptability, and they argued that if a scheme is equitable and revenue neutral, or the money is going back into transport, but crucially, people have experience of what happens in these schemes, that it would be equitable. And the reason they say that people having experience of these schemes working is they draw on the example of Stockholm, where they draw on the example of Oslo, where 80% of people were against a scheme to for road user charging in Oslo. But the scheme went ahead for a trial period of 7 months. And at the end of this trial period, it was clear that levels of congestion were down. And then the acceptability after people had seen the benefits was much higher than this theoretical idea of being charged more for driving. So that is it really. I hope that gives people a nice flavor of road user charging, what the evidence tells us, and my conclusions are here really. Evidence suggests potential for positive impacts. Public acceptability remains key, as do any potential impacts on inequality. And just to finish, I would say Stephen Glaister in 2014 gave us a SMED memorial lecture, and he entitled that "Road User Charging, Is It Always 10 Years Away?" And he concluded that it isn't always 10 years away, and I would, similarly, 7 years since his 2014 lecture, I would conclude that it doesn't feel 10 years away. It feels that actually road user charging is something which is seriously going to happen in the next few years, but it has seemed like that before and it hasn't happened. So we will await to see what happens there. But that is it. Thanks to some collaborators here, Janet and James at Cedar. And has anyone any questions?